All right, welcome everybody to DataWeave. Less code, fewer bugs, more functions. My name is Joshua Ernie. I'm an integration engineer at Mountain State Software Solutions. I've been developing MuleSoft for about 3 years now. I started when it was back on 3.7. Just a quick show of hands, has anyone here used MuleSoft before? Okay, so just about everybody's first time except for a couple people in the audience. Awesome. Before I begin, just a quick note that you should base all of your purchasing options and decisions on products and services that are currently available. So MuleSoft is an integration product, and one of the issues that we see with integrations is data transformation. And there are a few specific issues related to that. There's a ton of code that you need and libraries. Do you have within those libraries and any kind of extraneous code that isn't directly related to your transformation logic? Those are just extra areas for bugs to hide. And you spend too much time writing code that isn't transformation logic. So DataWeave is a programming language that was specifically designed to address the issues that I just went over in the previous slide. So it handles the complexities associated with data transformation so that we can spend more time focusing on actual transformation code instead of all of the peripheral requirements that go around with transforming. So DataWeave is an integral part of the Anypoint platform. Since most of you aren't familiar with MuleSoft, I'll briefly go over what the Anypoint platform is. It's basically just a suite of tools that you can use to create, deploy, monitor, and secure applications and their APIs. One thing you might be thinking is, why do I need another programming language? You might already know Java, C#, Python, JavaScript. Why do you need one specifically for doing data transformations? So, like we were discussing earlier, integrating systems can be an incredibly complex task, and part of that complexity is data transformation. There's more that goes into the data transformation than just doing the actual transformation. You have to consider things like parsing your data, serializing and deserializing your data, and these complexities wind up growing very quickly when you have a situation where you're trying to convert from a data format like CSV, like a flat file, to something like a nested JSON object. So when the shapes of the data are completely different, it just makes the problem even worse. So DataWeave really allows developers to focus on the transformation logic, while the underlying implementation takes care of all of those complexities like parsing, serializing, and deserializing your data. So this means that you spend more time writing code that actually addresses the transformation logic necessary to complete a task, while not spending time writing these other pieces of code where extra bugs can hide. So let's go over how this code looks. So you write DataWeave code either in Anypoint Platform's Flow Designer, which is a web-based tool that you can use to build your integrations, or you can use Anypoint Studio, which is an Eclipse-based editor that you can download to create your integrations locally. So here you can see a pane used in Anypoint Studio to modify your DataWeave code. From left to right, you have your input metadata. So there you can see your payload, what the type of the payload is, and any fields that might be in that payload. To the right of that, you see that blue section. This is just a mapping from your input fields over to your right, over to your output fields. And this is just a nice visual kind of reminder of what's going on with your mapping. On the third pane there, you have your output metadata. This is the same as your input, just if your output winds up using different fields, a different data type, that's reflected there as well. And then finally, on the right-hand side, you can see the actual DataWeave code. So you can see that this is a lot more than just kind of this dragging and dropping mapping from input to output. We can do things like assign variables. We can create functions that we can store in modules and reuse across projects. We can do casting and formatting dates and defining default values as well. So like I was saying, DataWeave supports a lot more than just mapping. Filtering, for example, is probably the second most popular data transformation that I see. It's essentially just removing values from an array based off of a certain criteria. That's known as filtering. So here we're filtering all the odd values out of the list. So we have an imperative example on the top where you can see we're describing exactly how to loop through this array, exactly how when we're removing objects from that array and how to remove them. It takes a lot of code just to do that, but if you look at the bottom, we're looking at DataWeave code there, and it tends to be a lot more concise and obvious what you're doing. In this case, we're just removing any kind of, we're removing any odd values from the array. So this declarative style that DataWeave gives us helps really keep things concise in our code. Ordering. So in this case, you can see the imperative example is a lot more verbose than the DataWeave example below it. It's really easy to miss the intent when it comes to ordering in languages like Java and C#, imperative languages like this. Not only that, you need to know things, like in this case, I'm using something like an anonymous class, an interface. You have to know all of these other things just to be able to do something simple like ordering. Whereas if you look at the DataWeave code, it's incredibly easy to tell at first glance what this code is doing. We're ordering by the size of each one of these strings. Data arithmetic, this winds up being very clear and concise as well. With your typical imperative programming language, data arithmetic can be a little verbose. I know that there are some libraries out there that really help with this, but for a while, they were kind of letting these object-oriented principles get in the way of simplicity and clarity. So when we have our DataWeave code, that actually winds up being a lot more concise. We take the function now, which returns the current date time, and we subtract a period of 1 day and assign that to a variable called yesterday. We have string transformation as well. You can do anything like you would in any other language, uppercase, lowercase. If you're familiar with Python, string slices should look very familiar to you. You can index from the back if you would like to as well. And you can also do replacements. So DataWeave has modules for a lot of other areas as well, including cryptography, arrays, objects, strings, timers, binaries, and URLs, including more. So if there isn't a function that meets your needs, you can always create one, store it in the module, and reuse it across your project. So let's go into a demo. Just a real quick overview of what we're going to be doing in this demo. So we'll be using an HTTP call into the Mule runtime, and what we'll do is we'll load a CSV. We will transform that CSV to JSON, and then return that JSON payload to the HTTP client. And after that, we'll go ahead and change our return payload to XML, and see how little code we have to change to make that change in the data format. So this is Anypoint Studio, like I was referring to earlier. On the left here, we have an HTTP listener. This is what we'll use to set up an endpoint that we can trigger from outside of the application via an HTTP call. We have a logger saying that we're reading the CSV. We actually read the CSV here from the local file system. And then a logger saying that we're transforming our data. So let's go ahead and take a look at the data that we're going to be working with. In the employees.csv, you can see we have last name, first initial, age, hire date, city, state, and status. And this is just representing a group of employees. For our output JSON, we want it to be in a format like this. You'll notice that most of it is essentially the same. It's just an array of objects. We've added employee ID. We've changed the date format a little bit. And we've also added the role towards the end. So let's go back to the code and see how we can implement something like that. The first thing you want to do is grab the transform message component and drag that over into your canvas. And this is very similar to what we saw earlier, but you'll notice that the input metadata and the output metadata aren't defined yet here. So how do we go about doing something like that? We're going to click Define Metadata. We'll click Add. And we're going to do the input CSV here. Create that type. Here you can pick from an array of types from Excel, CSV, JSON. We're going to pick CSV here. And we can it'll actually take the metadata from an example file that we give it. So let's look at that file that I was showing to you all earlier, which will be in source main resources, employees.csv. As you can see, all the fields that we had in that CSV file are now populated in here. We'll wrap that up. And you can see that this is starting to look more familiar with what I showed you earlier. We're going to do the same thing for the output metadata. Click Define Metadata. We'll add a new type. We'll call it output JSON. We'll select the type as JSON. And from here, you can either use something like a JSON schema, or you can use an example. Since we already have the example, let's go with that. So the same thing's going to happen here. Anypoint Studio is going to parse that example file. It's going to determine the metadata, and it's going to populate it for us. We'll finish this out. All right. So in order to create this mapping, you can do it in one of two ways. You could write the code yourself, or you could use the UI to have Anypoint Studio write most of the code for you. And that's what we're going to do here. So we'll take last name, drag it over to last name. And you can see in that right side pane, as we drag these fields over, Anypoint Studio is writing that DataWeave code for us. So this is a great way to get started with the language if you're not 100% familiar with it, or if it's like your first time using it. So as you can see, we're still missing two fields, employee ID and role. In this case, we'll actually write in employee ID. And we'll just make that index of payload 1 plus 1. So the index of payload 1 during the first iteration will be 0. During the second iteration, it'll be 2. So, 1 rather. So we're just going to add plus 1 to that so it starts at counting at 1. And for the role, we're going to use the same role for all of these. So let's just define that in a variable. We'll call it role. And include that there as well. So if you remember, there was one more thing we wanted to do. We needed to change the format of the date from the input CSV to the output JSON. So the format for our date is right here. So we're actually going to define this in a function that we can reuse across our project. We can do that using the fun keyword and format date. That's the name of the function. Any input parameters that we have, and then within the body we can define what we need to do. So in this case, we want it as a date. We define the format. In this case, it's like that. And then finally, we want to cast this back to a string in the format that we're looking for, which is, I believe, yep. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and run this application. And what I'll do is I'll just use Postman to send off an HTTP call like I was saying earlier. And what that'll do is trigger this flow. It'll run through this. We'll read the file from the local file system. We will transform the message and then return that back to the sender. So I just realized I forgot to actually call this function. Let's go ahead and do that. Format date. We'll pass it in the higher date that's coming from the CSV. If I save this, it'll just automatically reboot this real quick. All right. Go to Postman. We'll call the endpoint that I've exposed with that HTTP listener in the beginning of the flow. And you'll see that we get back the formatted data. So if we go back to Anypoint, you can see here in the logs, reading the CSV, transforming the data, and this is the output. Now, let's say the business comes back to you and they didn't gather their requirements really well. They made a lot of assumptions. It turns out they need an XML payload instead of a JSON payload. So originally, if we weren't using a language like DataWeave, we'd have to pull in entire new libraries to do XML instead of JSON and deal with that whole mess. Instead, what we're going to do is I'm just going to clear this metadata. I'm going to change the output to application/XML instead of application JSON. And I need to make a few changes because XML has some different rules than JSON does. Namely, you need to have a root element. So we'll call it employees. And that's actually going to be an array. And then employee. Each one of those will be what we defined earlier. Let's just go ahead and save this. This will reboot just like it did for us earlier. And we will go ahead and send another request. And there you go. With a few changes in the lines of code, we've completely transformed from using JSON earlier to using XML now. We didn't have to upload any new libraries and deal with any of the parsing or serialization and deserialization of the data. All right, so if you'd like to learn more about DataWeave, you can check out the MuleSoft documentation at the link I have above. There's some great blogs from the community as well, if you're interested. I'm a little biased. The first one is mine, and the second one is from another MuleSoft developer, Patrick, which is really great as well. If you want to learn more about what MuleSoft can do for you, you can check out a free trial at developer.mulesoft.com. Check out the user community, online training, and see any of the other MuleSoft presentations going on today. Any questions before we wrap up? Yes, sir.
So let's say I wanted to connect Salesforce to a database and do some data pipeline.
Right.
How would I do that? Like, how do you define connections between Salesforce and database using MuleSoft?
So the question was, and correct me if I'm wrong, how do you establish connections between two data sources like, for example, Salesforce and a database? Yeah. So in the Anypoint platform, they provide you something called connectors, and I believe from what I've heard, and I'm not super fluent in the Salesforce verbiage, but I believe they are akin to what you all refer to as adapters. So basically, a Salesforce connector will allow you to access Salesforce through the Mule tool, and then you'll use a database connector to do the same thing. Any kind of transformations that you need to do, you'll take that transform component and just put it in the middle of the two and do that transform.
You basically use DataWeave for any transformations within any data sources.
Correct.
As long as they can connect to MuleSoft.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. And you can define your own connectors as well if you need to, and write the code for those. But there's so many of them that you very rarely need to do that. All right. Thank you for your time, everyone.